All right, I'm here with Dr. Joe Packer from Central Michigan University, and I'm Danny Pross from Central Michigan University. Dr. Packer is the writer of Alien Life and Human Purpose, a Rhetorical Examination Through History, and that's your first book publication?
Yes.
That's coming out this September, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I want to start off by asking about the quote that's specifically been put forward by NASA as the area that they want discussed. The quote is by Carl Sagan, and in it he calls for, if Mars is discovered to have life on it, then it should be left to the Martians. That life on this other planet would be a treasure trove separate from our own and should be preserved above all other purposes. Have you encountered a similar sentiment to that in your research?
Well, not really. The folks that I'm looking at primarily are those who don't believe that alien life exists. And sort of the overlap or connection is that you see in the 1800s really sort of a willingness to say, well, alien life may exist in the form of something, right? Animals or potentially microbes, some form of tiny or insignificant, essentially, life. And because that life is not human-like, it doesn't have value, essentially. It's not on our level. It's not something that should concern us as far as decentering our central place, our place of importance in the universe. And so in that sense, the way that the research that I've done overlaps with that Sagan quote is that there is this sentiment throughout history to suggest that while microbes may exist on Mars, for example, they are not something to be taken particularly seriously. They're not something that we should be concerned about protecting, kind of protecting in and of their own right. Maybe there's some kind of scientific benefit for maintaining a sort of sanctuary of a independently involved life form, but that life form shouldn't sort of gain any kind of rights or any kind of moral value on face just because it is a alien life.
I've read in your book a little bit about something you call the unity myth. It seems to be the main topic of the book. How is the unity myth related to the idea of life on other planets?
So unity is the idea that life exists only on Earth, or important life, meaningful life, which is typically defined as human or human-like life exists only on Earth. And that term unity is in relation to the term plurality. So in the 1700s, there was this idea that there were a plurality of worlds, many worlds like ours that would have life that's more or less like humans. And so unity is the idea, the opposite, that our world is unique and that humans are therefore unique, sort of at the top of the food chains. And what the unity myth is it's a scientific myth in the sense that that's philosophy professor Stephen Toulmin uses the term. And what a scientific myth is where you take a question of scientific fact, so is evolution true or not, are there planets with alien life on them or not, and then you invest that sort of empirical question with philosophical, ethical, political, religious association where none really exists. So whether or not humans exist alone in the universe or whether humans exist in a universe full of alien life, that really has no one-to-one connection with any sort of ethical belief, right? That doesn't mean that stealing is right or wrong or what have you. Teleology is right or wrong. All of those things kind of can be debated independent of that question. But the idea of a scientific myth is conjoining these sort of independent philosophical questions with a scientific question, so that if you have proven the scientific question one way or another, you have also proven that philosophical system one way or another. So perhaps one of the most famous of these is the idea of social Darwinism. So how we should kind of structure our society and our social system and our philosophy really is independent of how we got to be where we are, right? So evolution can be true, but that doesn't mean that we should just let the poor and the weak die as a kind of further function of evolution. While evolution may be true, that doesn't mean that it has to inform kind of our ethical position. So similarly, the unity myth is the idea that because humans are alone in the universe, there is no other alien life that's similar to us, we have some kind of higher special purpose, and we kind of have access to absolute truth. So purpose being, teleology, and absolute truth being as opposed to the idea that we have kind of constructed our values, that they are relative and constructed by society.
Could you give a couple of examples of sort of famous names that we might connect with the unity myth?
So the most famous would be Plato. So the unity myth in Western culture really kind of has its genesis, or at least kind of its, whether or not he generated it, he kind of popularized it, coined the unity myth. And so he uses it in his dialogue, the Timaeus. So the idea, it's sort of one of a series of arguments he makes about the structure of the universe and what that structure means for how we should live our lives. So he sort of says we're at the center of the universe, and he kind of says that all of the objects that move around us are, they are connected to perfection. And he also says that there are no other worlds like ours. And the idea that there are no other worlds like ours says that we have this access to perfection, that the universe is sort of a model for how we should live our lives, and we can kind of look to the universe to find that. So that initially begins in the Timaeus, and the Timaeus kind of gets picked up by a lot of early Christian thinkers, because the idea of kind of a universe that imparts, ethical values and a connection to the divine, it speaks to certain members of the early Christian church. And so you see kind of Christian thinkers like Aquinas deploying the unity myth, and later on the Anglican philosopher and theologian William Whewell is another example. Alfred Russel Wallace, who is the co-discoverer of evolution, not a Christian per se, but someone interested in spiritualism, and also, a socialist, so not exactly of the same ilk as some of these earlier figures, uses it. And more recently, you see it to a lesser extent in the book Rare Earth, which was put out by Peter Ward and Donald Brownlee, and some other folks. So it's something that has a lot of staying power throughout history.
So you mentioned that one of them wasn't as consistent with the other ones. How consistent is the unity myth, or the scientific myth side of it that's connected to the unity idea?
Right. So what it means to be alone in the universe, what it means to exist in a universe where humanity exists independently, more or less, changes throughout history. So initially, the idea, kind of going back to Plato, was that our world is alone, and the idea, there wasn't really this conception at that time in Plato's cosmology that the planets were planets. So they wouldn't be harvesting life, they wouldn't be hosting any life. And so the idea was that there weren't any other universes, kind of, is what Plato was saying. And so under the Platonic interpretation, really it was saying that there was no other life anywhere, that our planet was the only abode for life. And then later on, after the discovery of the telescope, and it became more and more clear that some of these objects that are circling around us, circling around the sun, but circling around up in space, were like Earth. And at that point, people started to speculate, okay, well, maybe these things have life. And then the unity myth evolved a little bit to kind of open up to the idea, is to say, well, possibly, maybe there is life on these other planets, but it wouldn't be life like us. It wouldn't be life like humanity, thus it wouldn't be life that's sort of invested with ethical importance. It wouldn't challenge our place as not the physical center, but the sort of ethical and spiritual center of the universe.
Speaking of challenging our place, I do remember reading a line in your book about there would be a challenge and confusion to our ideology when alien life is discovered. Is that correct?
Yes, I do suggest that that is a distinct possibility. So, there's always a chance that it would do nothing, but I find that very unlikely. Um, because this unity myth has been so kind of long-standing, the idea that we're alone in the universe and thus we kind of have some importance, the kind of rupture of that could be very traumatic. So other people, very smart people, have kind of made the analogy to discovering aliens, maybe similar to the discovery of the quote unquote new world by European explorers. So obviously that was a very traumatic experience for the inhabitants of the new world, but it was also very disturbing for Europe, because Europeans kind of assumed that the entire world was their world and they were more or less at the center of it. So finding, two continents full of people who had no interaction, had no knowledge of them, who had just kind of happily living their lives absent any connection to Europe was kind of shocking to their sense of place in the world. And a similar sort of shock could come about with the discovery of alien life. But it also opens up the possibility to new scientific myths. So if kind of unity has been sort of a prevailing undercurrent within society, the unity myth isn't true in the sense that because unity exists, we have to feel a certain way. But the discovery of alien life, especially alien life that is undeniably intelligent in similar ways to how humans are intelligent, could open up the possibility for new plurality myths. So people making arguments that because we live in this universe with other life that is intelligent, that means this new way of approaching things. And most likely those plurality myths would be the reverse of the unity myth. So instead of values being absolute and humans being, at the center, maybe we're open to kind of different ways of being in the world and different ethical systems and different everything, just difference. We would be potentially more open to difference. So that's not necessarily going to happen, and it's not a requirement of that, but it's definitely a possibility and probably likely that those kind of things would be more likely in that world.
There's also a mention of the possibility of violence. Where does that come from in the idea of these myths being disrupted or ruptured?
So, well, because the unity myth exists, it creates a real incentive not to find intelligent life. Because intelligent life is in many ways directed against our sense of self-importance and value, it really kind of creates a incentive not to find it. And we see that playing out on Earth, right? So there are lots of animal species that seem undeniably intelligent. It's very difficult to define intelligence in a way that would exclude a variety of species who show emotions, who use tools, who can learn, and yet we've done it. We have kind of defined them out of intelligence, out of having any kind of, ethical rights, any kind of legal rights, defining us out of having any kind of ethical rights towards them. And we treat animals pretty terribly here. And so traveling to other planets, if we were to find life, it can be very difficult to one, determine what is life, and then determine, is that life intelligent? How should we treat that life? And the unity myth really kind of creates an incentive to not invest any life that we may find with any legal or ethical value. And that opens up the possibility of violence towards that life. And we really risk the chance that, we become sort of the creepy aliens of our nightmares, swooping down to other planets and picking up life and taking it off in our spaceships to go, conduct experiments on. So we kind of become our own nightmare figure.
That's a really interesting thought.
Thanks.
So you mentioned towards the end of your book that basically the plurality myth has taken more precedent lately. It's gotten more purchase in society than it has had up to this point. Is plurality connected to any sort of mythology as consistently as unity is?
So plurality, I think, is currently the leading scientific hypothesis, both among scientists and among the general population. So the idea that somewhere out there is alien life, most likely intelligence. The idea of a plurality myth holding much sway is a little bit different, and part of it, as your question suggests, is because plurality isn't as consistently connected to a set of ideas as unity is. So the idea that we're alone occasionally is used in maybe like an existentialist or even a pessimistic way. So I think it was in the Lars von Trier movie, the most recent movie. Basically, one of the characters says, humanity is alone in the universe. We grew up on Earth and we're a tragic mistake and we'll die, and then that'll be it for consciousness in the universe. But that's kind of a minority position, and there are a few other minority positions. But generally speaking, especially in the Western culture, the idea that humanity is alone in the universe has been tied to these ideas of value and the fact that there are these values that are absolute and they exist independently of humanity, and we have a special central location, not physically but metaphorically, in the universe. So plurality, on the other hand, has had scientific myths connected to it, but they are not as consistent through time. So Thomas Paine kind of made the argument that plurality makes Christianity ridiculous, that the idea that there would be all of these other planets really sort of makes Christianity look parochial and just not true, more or less. But that has not been the Christian position throughout time. Christian obviously means a lot of different things, and some folks have said there are no aliens, so that's kind of a position that's taken by creationists a lot of the time. But the Vatican Church is open to the idea that aliens exist on other planets, and there have been many important Christian theologians throughout time who have said that no, aliens exist, and actually the existence of so many planets full of life really reflects the divine greatness. So that's totally consistent, and you see a lot of religions that are connected with the idea of alien life, so Mormonism and Scientology and Raelianism. So these are all kind of religions associated with it. It's associated with theosophy, which is a sort of set of, it's kind of spiritualism. It's complicated, but it is tied sometimes to the idea that kind of races are different. We're not the same. We didn't evolve the same, and we weren't created the same. And in fact, different racial groups are different, and so it kind of has connections to Nazi philosophy, right? And so all of these things are very different, and they're just lots. So aliens, in many ways, are kind of a cosmic Rorschach test, where you can see in them what you want. Whereas the idea that aliens don't exist has had a more consistent meaning throughout history.
Okay, well, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
All right, well, thank you for interviewing me.
Just as one last thing, I want to give everyone I talk to the chance to register an opinion about the NASA topic. The NASA topic is specifically the idea that there should be international laws granting rights or recognition to alien life on other planets and preserving their planets for them. How do you feel, or if you would like to register an opinion, how would you feel about that topic?
Well, I it's a little bit away from my area of study, so this isn't necessarily kind of a opinion that is grounded directly in my study. But I do think that in kind of an overarching ban on interfering in any way with microbes on Mars would perhaps be a little short-sighted. For one, it may very well be that these are organisms that evolved in the same way as humans, given that biological material can be moved around in space. It's been demonstrated, so that's panspermia theory suggests that maybe we have kind of a common origin, and so there may not be this great scientific benefit in studying microorganisms, given the idea that they would have evolved independently of humans. But also, just I think that Mars could be very valuable potentially for human survival, kind of locating a place where we can go that's not Earth, but is similar enough to Earth that we can make a life there. And I think that kind of the survival of humanity is in many ways kind of more important than microbes, right? And so I think that if we're kind of extending rights to animals, non-human species, we would probably be better served extending those rights on Earth to species that are intelligent and we know kind of feel pain. Maybe we should begin there and not necessarily be so quick to grant those rights to alien species simply because they are alien, right? And so I think that it requires a lot of thought, and so definitely it's something that we should be thinking and debating about, but perhaps we can find some better criteria for sort of determining whether or not, and to what extent, if we do, should we interfere with alien life rather than just kind of a, yes-no ban on it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much again for speaking with us.
All right, thank you.